Jennifer. Great. So, you may have noticed that this book was published in 1984. It is an old book, and that's one of the issues that we're going to talk about, and that is old books. So just because it's 37 years old doesn't mean that it's not up to date and entirely valuable. I hope you're not insulted by reading such an old book, because usually we are focused on that which is original and new. So in the introduction, by the way, the author of the book is really the editor of the book. He's written the introduction, but I don't think he's written any of the other chapters. So he begins, of course, with the most famous story of all, the most famous story from the Talmud, and that is Al Regel Achat, the heathen that comes first to Shammai and then to Hillel, say, "Teach me all of Judaism while I stand on one foot." An absurd request. Shammai throws him out. Hillel does not throw him out, and Hillel is in this story, of course, the hero, and Shammai is this intolerant human being. But of course, I'm sorry. What Barry Holtz is saying, Shammai's response is not inappropriate. It is really very, very, very appropriate. We might have given a similar had we been asked to share everything we know about the fields, about our professional fields. And give me 3 minutes to. We would say, "Come on, that's absurd." And even Hillel's response is all the rest is commentary. Go and learn it, study, which is, of course, what we're all about. The word Torah, which we're all familiar, has several different meanings. Torah is very specifically the scroll that's in the Ark, but referring to the 5 books of Moses. But Torah can refer to the entire Tanakh, to the entire Bible. Torah can refer to all of written revelation, and Torah can refer to all of Jewish study, all things under the rubric of Jewish study can be referred to as Torah. Its authority is with God, and the human beings are God's agents in admitting it. One more admit here. Okay. Again, good morning, everyone, as we move ahead. A very important idea, of course, which will come up in one of the other chapters, is the entire idea that all of Jewish study is an inverted pyramid. Everybody sort of understand what the concept is, that everything begins with the Torah, or even with the Bible, and everything else, all other Jewish study is related to that. We start with the bottom of the pyramid, and all things blossom from that. Which he says the inverted pyramid is one of the great literary achievements of human culture. I don't know if you would agree, but that's one more admit here. But that's what he claims. So so that he doesn't use the word revelation, but in Jewish terminology, the Torah is thought of as revelation. It is from God. It contains the entire truth, and therefore everything else emanates from it, and all truth can be derived from that. If you have if you have the book on page 13, that quote from Gershom Shalom, who was one of the great Jewish scholars, at the very bottom of the page, the rabbis of the tradition, according to Shalom, believe that truth is given once and for all, and it's laid down with precision. Fundamentally, truth merely needs to be transmitted. The originality of the exploring scholar has two aspects. In his spontaneity, he develops and explains that which was transmitted at Sinai, no matter whether it was always known or whether it was forgotten and had to be rediscovered. The effort of the seeker after truth consists not in having new ideas, but rather in subordinating himself to the continuity of the tradition of the divine word and in laying open what he receives from it in context of his own time. In other words, not system, but commentary is the legitimate form through which truth is approached. Now, this is for Westerners, and I think of us all as Westerners with a Western education, this is very foreign and very alien. This whole pyramid, inverted pyramid concept, because we are imbued with the idea of originality, original ideas, original thoughts, original concepts. And Gershom Shalom is saying that the Jewish tradition is not about that kind of originality, but a different kind of discovery. They discover what the divine author had always intended. So, in other words, it's all there. All you have to do is somehow discover it. And all of this literature, in various ways, was various means by which Jewish scholars attempted to interpret the text. Now, what was originality if brand new ideas outside of the context of commentary was not originality? How was originality dealt with? Well, it was the idea, and he talks about, of a chiddush. People heard of a chiddush before? I have a chiddush. Comes from the Hebrew word chadash, which means new. I have a chiddush. I have a new interpretation. I have a new addition. I have a new way of looking at the text that we may not have discovered before. I have a new connection to make between one verse and another. And so that really is a new insight. Then, of course, there is the addition that not only do we have the written Torah, but we have the oral Torah. And from the traditional point of view, as I think many of us are familiar, is that when Moses came down from Mount Sinai, he brought with him not just the written Torah, but he brought with him an oral Torah. So the oral Torah is as original as the written Torah. And what is that? What is that oral Torah? Well, it's all the interpretation. There was a book not so long ago that was written, "Living by the Scripture." I don't remember what people familiar know what the title was. There was a book that was written in the last 10 years, and I got to tell you, it was a concept that was foreign to me, because you can't live by the because the written Torah is so sparse and incomplete that you really can't derive Shabbat and how Shabbat is observed from the Torah. You can't derive Jewish dietary laws directly from the Torah. Even so, and dietary laws are mentioned several times in the Torah, but they're with such contradictions that it's you need explanation, you need commentary, you need some sort of interpretation of what is meant. In his introduction, Barry says that the rabbis were not passive, but they were passionate and active readers, meaning they were exploring, uncovering secret meanings, unheard of explanations, which they saw as coming directly from God. So the concept underlying all of these interpretations is what the rabbis assumed about the biblical text, certainly about the Torah. What were their assumptions? Their assumptions were, number one, that it was from God. If it's from God, it is perfect. If it's perfect, then there are no contradictions. There are no redundancies. There are, and each word can have its own unique meaning. I have one more admit here. So if there is an apparent contradiction, it is only apparent, and it's our fault that we're not understanding it properly. So I'll give you an example. How many of every kind of animal was taken by Noah into the ark? 2, right? Male and female. Then turn to chapter 6. I think it's chapter 6. And it says very clearly that of all clean animals, Noah took 7 pair, and of unclean animals, he took 1 pair. Well, it's a clear contradiction. First of all, we have no idea by chapter 6 of Genesis what in heaven's name a clean animal is. Does that mean a kosher animal? Does that mean an animal that was okay for it's totally unclear. So the rabbis can't say we have a contradiction here. They have to find a way to say the Torah is perfect, and it was there for us to explain. And then, of course, part of the Torah is daily law observance, so that it would impact every day of one's life, and there's a sense that each text becomes basic for later text. That the Torah itself demands interpretation, and therefore we get all these very different kinds of literature that grow out in different periods of time. They don't happen all at the same time. They happen in different eras. Any question or comment about this whole idea of originality? Anybody want to share an idea? This is really not an idea that is. Yes, we read Shakespeare, and we want to interpret what Shakespeare meant, and we do interpretations. But life doesn't end with Shakespeare. And we have new original authors, but the rabbis did not intend for anything to be outside the context of Torah. All of it came back to some interpreting God's truth, God's will that came as a part of Revelation. Anybody have any want to share any thoughts about that? You can certainly unmute.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
I might ask, when you say God's truth, you mean the written Torah. You do not mean the oral Torah.
No, I mean the whole thing.
Okay.
The whole thing, because of course the oral Torah came down with the written Torah. How to observe Shabbat in Jewish thought all came down together. You know, the only thing it says in the Torah is you may not seethe a kid in its mother's milk. Where do we get from there to separating milk and meat? I mean, they two have nothing to do with each other. Where do we get the idea that chicken is meat, but fish is not meat? It's all part of the oral Torah and interpretation, which builds on that after that. So the oral Torah as well becomes a basis for interpretation. Marlene, did you want to add something?
No, not really.
Oh, okay.
I was just thinking about that, though. You mean, in other words, that the rabbis interpreted these and then they became laws at the Sanhedrin or whatever?
Well, in order for something to become part of the legal, it had to be based. It had to have its origin in the Torah, or in some way of. My favorite example is to this day. My favorite example is our organ transplants permitted in Jewish life. Well, that's a very big question, because in order to transplant an organ, we're talking about a major organ. We're talking about transplanting a heart. How do you transplant a heart? You can't allow a person to die, because once a person dies, their organs die. So one has to somehow find a definition of death. You have to use the text in order to find a way. You can't just say, it's the right thing to do organ transplants. I mean, that, you can start with that idea, but now how do you get there? You have to use the interpretation of text to get there. I'm not going to go there because it really takes too long to explain how we get there. Issues of homosexuality. The Torah seems pretty clear. A man may not lie with another man as he lies with a woman. Okay. Does this apply to lesbianism? Well, it's not. It seems not. And what does that whole verse mean? So we have to have to interpret it in light of contemporary thought. Lisa?
Well, this reminds me a little bit of constitutional law and how it refers, in the cases you refer back to prior cases and to the original document, the Constitution, and at times the Declaration of Independence. And what becomes law is the accepted interpretation, even though there's dissent, like I haven't read the Talmud, but what I've read about the Talmud, like why did Hillel's interpretation get accepted versus Shammai's? Something happened, whether it was more acceptable to more people or what, that's what's carried forward. And that's very much like constitutional law. Although I don't know how to interpret this court, but otherwise it's very similar, I think.
I think it's a very, very clear parallel. That the issue, in constitutional law, you're dealing with precedent.
Mm-hmm.
Here, it's not necessarily precedent, but yes, it goes back to the Constitution.
Yeah, and you're creating a body of law based on things that happen moving forward and in current times, and it makes it more current.
We don't have in Judaism this debate about what do they call it, originality, originalism.
Right.
What did the framers of the Constitution, what did they think at that time?
But there is discussion of what does the written Torah really mean, right? That's sort of the same thing.
We don't have that originalism because there's a sense that there isn't a passage of time. The Torah is current, is today. And so we don't have this idea that the authors of the Torah, or the author of the Torah, is God. That somehow thinking might have changed. It's somehow eternal and speaks to us today. That's what's so interesting, that it's eternal and it continues to be relevant. In many ways, that's the challenge. How do we deal with contemporary issues, whether they are moral issues, ethical issues, religious issues? How do we deal with them? Today? Anybody else want to share anything about this whole idea of originality? Elaine, I think you're speaking, but I can't. But you have to unmute. Elaine, are you speaking? You have to unmute. I don't think I can unmute you. Can everybody see Elaine speaking, but I can't hear her? Okay. I don't know if she's speaking to Arnold or if she's speaking to us. Elaine, are you speaking to us? If so, you have to unmute. You have to go up to the top of your picture, and it'll say unmute, and click on it. There's a blue box that says unmute. Well, I don't know what else to help Elaine with, but she has something on her mind. Okay, this concept is something that we're going to keep in mind through, when we talk about Talmud. The Talmud is original, but it's part of the pyramid, of the inverted pyramid. It is the rabbis wrestling with the text, with the Torah, and their ideas have to come back to the Torah in their own time. They are the Talmud is being written. The Mishnah is completed around the year 200, and the Gemara is finished around the year 500. So between the year 200 and 500, we receive the Talmud text. But even that text has to be interpreted. Rashi doesn't come along until the 10th century. Rashi comments on the Talmud, and today people wonder, how did people study the Talmud without Rashi?
Yeah.
So,
Rabbi, all right, so where do the...
it was complete. Now I can hear you, Elaine.
Okay, so where do the differences among Orthodox, conservative, and Reform fit into this interpretation?
I think that's a complicated question. However, in a debate that occurred a number of years ago at Lincoln Square Synagogue, in which the chancellor of the seminary debated with the rabbi of Lincoln Square Synagogue, he said that the difference between Orthodox Judaism and conservative Judaism is that one is oh goodness, what's the term? One is a strict constructionist, and the other is a loose constructionist interpretation. What is a strict constructionist and loose constructionist? There's a debate going that happened as a result of the abortion decision as to whether there is in the Constitution the right to privacy. Strict constructionists said, Lisa, correct me if I'm wrong here, strict constructionists said, nowhere in the Constitution does it say privacy. Privacy isn't there. Loose constructionists said, oh, yes, it is. And here we find it in this amendment where it says that you're entitled to have a privacy in your home. So loose constructionists sort of were more liberal in their interpretation. So I'll give you a bad example, but an example anyway. How many of you like swordfish?
Yeah.
I like swordfish. Well, as I'm sure you all know, in order for fish to be kosher, it has to have fins and scales, right? Well, swordfish, I don't know this from personal experience. Swordfish is a fish that when it's young has scales, and then it loses its scales as it matures. So the fish that we eat is a fish without scales. So again, this is a bad example, but nevertheless, most Orthodox authorities say swordfish is not kosher. Even some conservative rabbis say swordfish is not kosher, but many of them say, no, it doesn't say when it had fins and scales. It just says it had to have fins and scales. So therefore, we have loose constructionists and strict constructionists. That's how Chancellor Ismar Shorsh explained the difference between Orthodox and conservative. I think it's more complicated than that, but I think it's a very interesting way. In other words, both Orthodox and conservative Jews are feel the authority of the law, and yet they are willing to more loosely interpret the law. The same could go for how we get to women's participation. The same is how we get to dealing with homosexuality. The same is dealing with all kinds of issues. Now, the reform began with an idea that the law is ancient. It that kashrut came about because of health reasons. We know an awful lot of people who don't keep kosher, who don't get sick, and an awful lot of people who do keep kosher who aren't any healthier than people who don't keep kosher. So the reform movement really began with the idea that we have to modernize Judaism. We have to get rid of all the aspects that are not relevant any longer. So, Elaine, I would think that that's really the how I would explain sort of the difference between Orthodox, conservative, and reform. In the way I've explained it, Orthodoxy and conservative are much closer together than reform. But I think most people would say conservative and reform are much closer to each other than they are to Orthodoxy. Let me go on, because that's the first part of his introduction. Is getting this whole idea of originality in Jewish life, in Jewish thought, in Jewish text, is not about having brand new concepts about the environment or about gun safety, or whatever the issue is. It is interpretation of using the text, finding a way within the text to find various ways of explaining God's revelation. Then he talks about three other aspects that he says are important in understanding. First of all, no one, people who are engaged in Talmud study, in Jewish study, usually don't talk about reading the text. They talk about learning the text, and that usually is done not alone. People study in Chevruta, which often means in pairs, or in or three people studying a text together. So very often the model is three, usually men, but not necessarily men, three men sitting together with an open text between them. The first one reads a piece of the text, maybe a verse or maybe a small section. The second one translates it into whatever language they're studying. Even if it's Hebrew, it gets translated sometimes from Aramaic into modern Hebrew or into English. And then the third one explains what that means. Once they have some sort of agreement, then they continue on. But now they switch roles. The one who translates becomes the reader. The next one becomes the translator. The third one becomes the explainer. And if the three of them if the other two don't like the explanation, or they think there's something that he missed, then they will continue the conversation until they have some sort of agreement as to what that text, and it might be just one line, is really all about. And very often the study was done in the academy. So we have this very famous story of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, who is teaching, and Moses is sitting according to the story in the Talmud, Moses is sitting in the 8th row, insult because there was a pecking order. The brightest student sat in the front. Moses sitting and he doesn't understand what Rabbi Akiva is saying. And we go on with his famous story. But the fact is that much of study was done in an academy with a mentor, with a teacher. I wrote here a note to myself. Something I think, all of us having a Western education. A Western education, I've talked about this before, a Western education is based on the whole idea of development and evolution. That there are ideas that that move on in various ways and they develop. That's not necessarily the idea, as I referred to before, of the Torah. When you study the Torah, when you study the Talmud, it is alive. And I want to share with you an incident that occurred with me many years ago. Recently, Carol and I were in Ithaca for our granddaughter's graduation. And by going to Cornell, I was able to visit with a very old friend who was my junior high school debate partner, was best man at our wedding, and who teaches Judaism at Cornell. Well, Ross and I had a third friend in Israel. We're talking about 1969, 1970. His name was Leon. Leon grew up in a very Orthodox environment. He went to yeshiva. He had a very different elementary education and even high school education than either Ross or I did. And the three of us rented a car during a vacation and we drove around Israel. We were north, and we went to an area that's called Mount Meron. Mount Meron is across the valley from the northern city of Tzfat or Safed. Mount Meron didn't mean much for Ross or for me, but it meant something very specific for Leon. On Mount Meron, there is the grave of a very famous rabbi, and there are many stories in the Talmud about the rabbis who lived in the area of Mount Meron. So an old man came to us, and he started telling us Talmud stories. Now, all of a sudden, something happened to Leon that didn't happen to Ross or to me. All of a sudden, Leon was in a trance. I mean, literally in a trance, because these people, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi and Shmuel, they were people. They were individuals who peopled Leon's life through his whole education, and all of a sudden, he had this vision of these people wandering around Mount Meron. Now, for me, hearing those stories, okay, they're very lovely stories. I was familiar with some of them, but they happened 2,000 years ago. That's history. They weren't history for Leon. And although Leon was no longer Orthodox, Leon was no longer studying in the yeshiva, it said something, this story says something about how, in many ways, the texts are studied. That these people, whether they're from the Torah or they are Talmudic individuals, the whole sense of history is collapsed, and it's all contemporary. That the conversation that Rabbi Akiva, that Hillel and Shammai had is not a conversation that happened so long ago. It's a conversation that's happening right now. And what they're debating is an important idea right now. I think that's very difficult for those of us that grew up, because every part of our education, whatever we studied, every part of our education is studied in a historical perspective. How did things develop? How did things change? What were ideas, in various in different times, and how did they develop? It's a very, very interesting idea. And then not only is it happening right now, but all of it has practical implication, both religious and ethical. One of the Talmud tractates begins with a whole notion of property. Well, these are ancient notions of property, but begins with who find an object, both claiming it's mine. This one says it's mine, this one says it's mine. How is it to be determined what you do with this found object? So that's and you for all issues you can refer back. The most modern issue, you can refer back and find some connection to the tradition. So these were three areas that Barry Holt says make study foreign and difficult. One is that we're used to studying by ourselves, by reading on our own, not studying in a group. We may come together in a class after we do reading like we're doing in this class, but we read on our own, we absorb the material, we don't do it, as I explained, in Chevruta style. And I think he says at one point, what is the importance of having this kind of Chevruta style? One reads, one translates, one interprets, because one studies to become part of the Jewish people. There's a purpose to this study, not simply to add knowledge to your brain, but to participate in the community. The second challenge in approaching traditional texts is that they are traditionally studied in the original, whether it's Hebrew or whether it's Aramaic. The texts are studied in their original, and in every case, as we all know, translations are problematic. Translations, you lose something. My favorite story here is evidently it's a true story, that when there was in Eastern Europe, Jews spoke Yiddish. They may have also spoken Polish or Russian wherever they lived, but their language was Yiddish, and everything was translated into Yiddish. All great literature was translated into Yiddish. So they evidently, when Shakespeare was translated into Yiddish, the title page said, Shakespeare, verteidigt und verbessert, which means Shakespeare translated into Yiddish and improved. Of course, the whole issue of studying Shakespeare is the language. Now, it may be difficult for us to read Shakespeare because it's written in Old English, and we need to study it. But the language, the jokes, all the turn of phrase is you can't get all of Shakespeare if you read it in another language. You have to read Shakespeare in English in order to get it. Yeah, you can read it in French. You can read it but in order to really understand Shakespeare, you have to read the original. Well, the same is true for the Torah. The same is true for the Talmud. You lose something, a lot of the nuance, a lot of the wordplay, which we'll talk about next week, if you do it in English. There's a whole issue, which I'm sure you are familiar with, and that's called gematria, which is that in Hebrew all the letters have numerical value. Aleph is 1, Bet is 2. They go all the way up to the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which is Taf, which is the value of 400. So it was somewhat playful, but it's more than playful. I'll give you an example. When Jacob meets up with his brother Esau, and he says that he lived with his uncle. He says, with my uncle Garti, I lived. Well, the word Garti, which means live, but if you take the letters Garti, Gimel, Resh, Taf, Yud, you add up the numbers. Gimel is 3, Resh is 200, Taf is 400, and Yud is 10. How much do we get? 613. Oh, 613 is a very important number in Judaism. We have 613, traditionally 613 commandments. What was Jacob saying to his brother? While I lived with my uncle Laban, I observed all the commandments. And that we get from gematria. Well, gematria, you can't, you have to read the original and be able to play with now that may sound unimportant, but it's one of the things that is necessary. And Holt says, and one of the challenges is there are an awful lot of things that remain untranslated, that you have to read the original. Jennifer.
Nan and Ellen had their hand up. I don't know if they had something before us.
Okay, I didn't see the order.
There's no hurry, Jennifer. Thank you. Go ahead.
So, I get the inverted pyramid. We're all Jewish, so we're, basing all of our thoughts on, we're studying, people are studying based on a central text, which gives us that common place to start. But I'm wondering how, in the last class, we were having some discussions about some of the philosophers that sort of ended up being ostracized, told that you're out of bounds, you're out of that pyramid. So I'm curious about that. Was it that their ideas were too original? So I just was curious about that.
Some of it I think has to do with what someone's reputation is. And once you've built a reputation, I think it's, is it good art or not good art? Well, if it's got the name Rembrandt on it, it's automatically good art. That's, of course, an extreme example. If it's a newcomer who doesn't have a reputation, well, we have to decide, is he in the tent or has he really gone beyond the tent? And in some cases, there was a sense that that's not a legitimate interpretation. Yeah, and Maimonides' texts itself were burned. There were those who said that Maimonides was going into areas that were and interpretations that were illegitimate. So things that can have to do with the times, they can have to do with style, they can have to do with all kinds of, but yes, there were people who were whose ideas were not thought as part of the mainstream, and they were outside. Is that sort of in response to what you were saying, Jennifer?
Yeah, but I'm curious who decides that? You know, what is the authority that says, no, you're too original. You're out of here because that's way out of bounds.
I don't know that there is an authority that does that. I'm not sure. You know, people published texts, and the question was it seen by the Gedolei Hador, the great ones of that generation? Was this seen as British, or was this seen as and you know, interesting, I said that Maimonides' books were burned, and yet today among Orthodox Jews, he's received sainthood. So it can how that's decided, I think that's I wouldn't even venture to guess, but I think that's a very good question. Nan?
Yes, thank you, Rabbi. Please excuse me, everybody. We were flying all day last Thursday, and this Thursday I was flying from Costco, so we came in a little late. Sorry, can we just, since it's almost the end of the class, can we just talk to you for just a few minutes at the end and get better oriented to what's going on?
Sure. I really just wanted to add one last piece, and then we'll. And that was, he talks about the challenge that affected Jews and non-Jews, in that there was an attitude within Christianity that somehow once there was a New Testament, that Jewish texts were somehow irrelevant. As a matter of fact, theologically, it came that God had taken his grace away from the Jewish people and had given it to new Israel, meaning to Christianity, and Jews were very affected by that too. So that Jewish creativity must have ended when the New Testament came along. So here were the three aspects. Language was a challenge. Reading in the original, if you don't know Hebrew or Aramaic, learning without a community, learning on your own is a challenge. And the idea of, does Jewish interpretation still have value after Christianity was seen as superseding Judaism? Yeah. So Lisa.
Well, I think, I don't remember if he talked about it, but I think it's also how you read the Old Testament, because certainly the Puritans and different Protestant groups rely a lot on the Old Testament, but they read it as a foreshadowing of Jesus more so than a text on its own that has its own integral validity. And so that's very different, but they don't reject the Old Testament. It's just how they use it is so different that it doesn't allow for Judaism in its own right, in my opinion.
Yes, the best example for me is the story that we call Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac.
Mhm. Interesting.
Christians generally refer to that as the sacrifice of Isaac. Why do they call it the sacrifice of Isaac? Because that story in Genesis prefigures the crucifixion. And therefore, the story is called the sacrifice of Isaac. In most Christian references, where Jews would never refer to it as sacrifice. The whole purpose of the story, whole moral of the story is that Isaac was not sacrificed. So yes, I think it is very often we read sometimes the same story and we read it
Entirely differently.
we read it differently. So Jennifer, tell me what you were thinking about before.
In terms of the
class, I guess.
I'm not sure what.
I think so.
Okay.
I think you meant Jennifer. I think you meant
Oh, did you mean Nan?
man.
Nan was
I
asking.
mean, Nan,
about-
yes, I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
Sorry.
I'm
was
sorry.
thinking, wow, I
Oh, I
didn't know
answered
had
it,
any
Jennifer.
authority
Don't
on this.
worry. Okay, you want my questions now?
Sure.
Yes? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. First of all, it says on here that on the picture that these sessions are being recorded. So is there some place where Alan and I could access a recording of last week, for example?
Well, there was no last. This is the first week.
Oh, I thought so. Okay, so.
This is the first. So that's number one. Number
Okay,
two,
one. Yes.
it's recorded. If I press the button that says record. If I don't press the button that says record, it doesn't get recorded. And if people are uncomfortable with it being recorded, I won't press that button. So if anybody is uncomfortable with
Oh,
the class.
no issue about that. The second question is there a text for this course or readings or what?
Yes, it is the book that's titled Back to the Sources.
Ah, I guess I didn't buy it because we were on our way east anyway.
By
Thank you.
edited by Barry W. Holtz.
Okay.
It comes with different covers. There is a hard cover. There is this soft cover. There is one can get it on Kindle. Yes, Sue's holding up hers, which looks very different.
Ah, thank you,
But
Sue.
it's the same text.
Does the RA carry it or any Jewish outlets or no?
If you
Okay.
go to Amazon carries it. Was published by the one I have is Simon & Schuster.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. And then I wondered, we must have discussed this at the beginning of this class. I got the constitutional aspects of originality because, of course, I studied constitutional law.
Yeah.
But do you mind just reprising what you probably initially said for context about the term originality as it relates to the Torah?
Just in brief, we in our daily life in the 21st century, we are fixated on what Barry Holtz calls originality. We want new ideas. We're interested in reading poets who are writing about subjects that no one ever dealt with before, with authors, with plays, with things that we call original. And what Barry Holtz is trying to get us to understand is that originality in Jewish text is something completely different. Originality is a chiddush, is an idea that is an aspect of interpretation. Now that interpretation can be, it can be very much connected to a text. It can be somewhat far-fetched, but that's so that's where this idea of the inverted pyramid comes from. That it's all connected to the Bible. He refers to it as the Bible, but I would say it's all connected to Torah. We really don't derive halacha from the prophets. We don't derive halacha from Psalms, from other aspects. Jewish law is Jewish values might be derived from these other texts. We derive certain values from reading Job, from reading Ecclesiastes, from reading, but not Jewish law.
Pardon me, Rabbi, but it is after time.
Yep. And so if people want to go and get back to seeing the hearings, I understand. I'm just going to. So for next week, by the way, we're going to read the next chapter, which is a little longer, which is about biblical narrative. And the week after that, we were going to read both the other two chapters about the Bible. That would be biblical law and biblical poetry. So that's for next week and the week after. Next week is the chapter on biblical narrative.
Thank you.
Lisa.
Okay.
Lisa, did you want to add something else? You have your hand up.
Yeah.
No? Okay. So terrific, everyone. Thank you all for being here. I think.
second. Did you say just
biblical-
one chapter for next week? Just
One
biblical
chapter for
narrative?
next week. One
Oh, okay.
chapter.
Just one. All right, thank you.
And I think a lot of it is familiar, biblical narrative, but a lot of it is, so come with questions, because he talks about the Bible doing all kinds of biblical literature, narrative, which is the story, doing all kinds of different things, important ways in which the narrative can be read and interpreted. And he gives very good examples. Almost all of them are from the book of Genesis. So hopefully the examples are familiar, or you can look them up. All right.
Okay.
Rabbi, are there chapter numbers that you could tell us?
It's chapter 1A for next week and chapter 1B and C for
Right. Yes. 1A for next week,
Yeah,
which takes us to page 83, even so there's several pages of references. And then 1B and C for the week after that.
and today was the first
Introduction.
introduction for today. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, everybody, for your patience with the newcomers.
Yeah. Thank you.
Terrific.
Thanks,
Thank-
Rabbi.
I think.